Welcome. You've found a space to slow down for a moment. Here, we explore stories from the past, distant, but still familiar in their humanity. Whether you're getting ready to sleep or just looking to unwind, I appreciate you being here. Let me know where you're tuning in from, what city or country, and what time it is when you press play. It's always interesting to see how history quietly connects us. If you find peace in this kind of calm storytelling, consider subscribing. There are plenty more stories ahead. The year is 1347, and you've just woken up in what will soon become one of history's greatest nightmares. But right now, in this moment before the darkness descends, you don't know that yet. You stretch in your straw bed, scratch at the flea bites that have become as familiar as breathing, and stumble toward another day of grinding survival in medieval Europe. The air outside your hovel is thick with the usual symphony of stenches. Human waste flows freely through the streets, mixing with animal droppings and rotting food scraps into a putrid soup that squelches beneath your bare feet. Your neighbors are already stirring, coughing that familiar morning cough that everyone seems to have these days. Nothing unusual there. Coughing is as common as breathing when you live packed together like livestock in conditions that would horrify a modern pig farmer. You splash some questionable water on your face from a bucket that's been sitting outside your door. The water came from the same river where people relieve themselves, where animals drink, where the dead are sometimes dumped when families can't afford proper burial. But it's water, and water is life, even when it's trying to kill you. Your breakfast, if you can call it that, consists of a chunk of bread so hard it could double as a weapon, and some watery ale that tastes like it was brewed in someone's boot. The bread is made from whatever grain could be scraped together, bulked out with sawdust, ground acorns, and other creative additions that make you grateful you can't quite identify them all. But you eat it anyway, because hunger is a more immediate threat than whatever mysterious ingredients might be lurking in your meal. As you chew your way through this culinary adventure, you notice old Henrik from down the lane stumbling past your window. He's got that grey pallor that's been going around lately, and he's clutching his side like something's gnawing at him from the inside. His wife trails behind him, wringing her hands and muttering prayers that seem to bounce off the morning air like stones off water. Nothing too concerning, though. People get sick all the time in your world. They recover or they don't. Life goes on because it has to. There's grain to thresh, animals to tend, and lords to satisfy with their endless demands for tribute and labour. You can't afford to worry about every cough, every fever, every strange swelling that appears on someone's neck. But Henrik looks different today. There's something in his eyes, a kind of distant terror, as if he's seeing something the rest of you can't. When he opens his mouth to greet you, instead of words, a thin stream of blood trickles down his chin. He stares at it in confusion, as if wondering how it got there. You watch him continue down the muddy lane, weaving slightly, and you feel a small chill that has nothing to do with the morning air. Something's different about this sickness. Something's wrong in a way that goes beyond the usual parade of ailments that march through your community like unwelcome relatives. Down at the market, the mood feels strange. Merchants who usually hawk their wares with boisterous enthusiasm seem subdued, their voices carrying an undertone of worry. Margot the breadwoman keeps glancing nervously at her customers, as if she's expecting them to suddenly sprout horns or collapse on the spot. When someone coughs too close to her stall, she actually flinches. The talk is all whispers today. Strange ships in the harbour, they say. Ships from the east, carrying spices and silks and other luxuries that make your mouth water. But something else too. Something the sailors won't talk about directly, only in hushed tones when they think no one's listening. Stories filter through the crowd like smoke. A port city to the south, completely silent now. Ships found drifting with no living crew aboard. entire families discovered in their homes, sitting around their dinner tables as if they'd simply decided to take a very long nap, except for the black swellings on their necks and the expressions of agony frozen on their faces. Nonsense, surely. The kind of wild tales that spread through communities like yours when people have too little real news and too much imagination. Everyone knows stories grow in the telling, becoming more fantastic with each repetition. By the time a rumour reaches your village, a stubbed toe has become a severed limb, and a mild fever has transformed into divine punishment. But the fear in people's eyes feels real. There's something primal about it, the kind of terror that comes from sensing a predator, even when you can't see it yet. Animals feel it too. The dogs seem restless, pacing and whining for no apparent reason. The cats have disappeared entirely, as if they know something you don't. You spend your day doing what you always do, because routine is the only anchor you have in a world that seems determined to sweep you away. You work in the fields, bent over, under the merciless sun, pulling weeds and praying that this year's harvest will be enough to see you through the winter. Your back aches, your hands bleed, and your stomach growls with the constant hunger that's been your companion since birth. But as the day wears on, you notice more people looking like Henrik, that same grey pallor, that same distant look in their eyes. Some are clutching their sides or their necks, as if trying to hold something in. Others seem to be burning with fever despite the cool autumn air, their faces flushed and their breathing rapid and shallow. By evening, Henrik is dead. His wife found him collapsed in their garden, his body already growing cold, those strange black swellings on his neck now grotesquely enlarged. The sight of him sends a ripple of panic through the village. This isn't just another seasonal sickness. This is something else entirely. The priest arrives to give last rites, but even he seems shaken. Father Benedict has seen death in all its forms during his years of service, but there's something about Henrik's corpse that makes him hurry through the prayers and back away as quickly as decency allows. When pressed, he admits he's never seen anything quite like those swellings before. As night falls, you huddle in your hovel with your family, listening to the sounds of your village settling into an uneasy sleep. But sleep doesn't come easily tonight. Every cough from a neighbouring house, every groan of settling timber, every rustle of wind through the thatch makes you start. The darkness feels different somehow, heavier, as if it's carrying something new and terrible in its embrace. You don't know it yet, but you've just witnessed the opening act of the greatest catastrophe in human history. That thing that killed Henrik, that strange sickness with its black swellings and bloody cough, has a name that will echo through the centuries: the Black Death. And it's just getting started. In the months to come, it will sweep across Europe like a dark tide, killing 1 out of every 3 people it encounters. It will topple kingdoms, destroy cities, and remake the very fabric of society. It will turn neighbours against neighbours, children against parents, and believers against their God. It will make survival itself seem like a miracle, and death seem like a mercy. But tonight, you don't know any of that. Tonight, you're just a medieval peasant, lying on your straw mattress, listening to your family breathe in the darkness and trying not to think about Henrik's grey face or the fear in Father Benedict's eyes. You're trying to convince yourself that tomorrow will be just another day of grinding survival, same as always. You're wrong, of course. Tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow, the nightmare begins in earnest. But for now, in these last few hours of the world as you know it, you close your eyes and try to sleep. Because sleep is still possible tonight. Soon, even that small mercy will be taken away. The Black Death is coming to your village, and nothing will ever be the same again. The morning sun filtered weakly through the shuttered windows of what had once been a thriving village, casting pale shadows across empty streets, littered with the detritus of civilization's collapse. You had survived the Black Death. Yes, but as you stepped carefully over the remnants of your former life, you began to understand that survival was perhaps the cruelest joke the plague could play. Because surviving the Black Death wasn't the end of your nightmare. It was merely the intermission. The world you emerged into bore little resemblance to the one you'd known before the pestilence arrived. Entire villages had been wiped from existence, their inhabitants reduced to shallow graves, hastily dug by whoever remained conscious long enough to wield a shovel. The lucky ones had been buried at all. In many places, the dead simply lay where they fell, their bodies becoming part of the landscape until scavengers and time reduced them to scattered bones. Your own village, if it could still be called that, had been home to perhaps 300 souls before the plague. Now, you could count the survivors on your fingers. Margaret the baker's wife, though her husband lay mouldering in what used to be their kitchen. Young Willem the blacksmith's apprentice who'd watched his master die in agony while the forge grew cold. Old Henrik the shepherd, whose flock had wandered away to die in the fields when there was no one left to tend them. The silence was the worst part. Villages that had once buzzed with the constant hum of human activity now lay wrapped in an oppressive quiet, broken only by the occasional creak of a door swinging in the wind or the distant howl of wild dogs that had learned to hunt in packs. The very air seemed to hold its breath, as if the world itself was still waiting for the plague to return, and it would return. That was the terrible certainty that haunted every survivor's dreams. The Black Death wasn't a single catastrophe, but a recurring nightmare that swept across Europe in waves, each outbreak finding the survivors just as they'd begun to rebuild their shattered lives. Just as you'd started to believe that perhaps the worst was over, the familiar symptoms would appear again. The swellings, the fever, the black blood. Sometimes it took years between outbreaks, sometimes mere months. The plague had taught you that hope was a luxury you could no longer afford. But even without the plague's return, survival came with its own unique torments. The economic structure that had held medieval society together had collapsed as thoroughly as a house of cards in a hurricane. The complex web of obligations, services, and payments that bound lord to peasant, craftsman to customer, farmer to market, had been severed by death. Money, what little of it existed, had become nearly worthless when there was nothing left to buy and no one left to sell it. Food, ironically, was both abundant and scarce. The fields that had been planted before the plague still grew, but there were far too few people left to harvest them properly. Grain rotted in the ground while survivors starved, lacking the knowledge or energy to gather what remained. Livestock wandered free, having broken through fences when their owners died. Some had reverted to wildness, becoming dangerous to approach. Others had simply died of neglect, their carcasses adding to the overwhelming stench of decay that seemed to cling to everything. The few animals that remained healthy were often too valuable to slaughter for food. A single cow or horse might mean the difference between survival and starvation through the coming winter. But caring for these animals required knowledge that had died with their original owners. How do you treat a sick horse when the stable master is dead? How do you preserve meat when the butcher's family lies buried in the churchyard? The practical knowledge that had been passed down through generations had been lost in a matter of months. Trade, the lifeblood of medieval civilization, had ground to a halt. The merchants who had once travelled from town to town, bringing goods and news from distant places, were mostly dead or too afraid to travel roads that might be plague-infested. Even if they had been willing to risk the journey, what was the point? The towns they might have visited were empty ruins, their markets silent, their customers buried in mass graves. This economic collapse created a vicious cycle of desperation. Without trade, there was no way to acquire the tools and materials needed to rebuild. Without craftsmen, there was no one to repair the tools that remained. Without farmers, there was no reliable food supply. Without food, there was no energy to work. The survivors found themselves trapped in a downward spiral that seemed to have no bottom. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of survival was the psychological toll. You had watched your family die in agony, powerless to help them. You had seen your friends and neighbours succumb one by one to a disease that showed no mercy to young or old, rich or poor, virtuous or wicked. The randomness of who lived and who died had shattered any faith you might have had in divine justice or natural order. The church, which had once provided comfort and guidance in times of trouble, had been decimated along with everyone else. Priests had died at even higher rates than the general population, their close contact with the sick and dying making them particularly vulnerable to infection. Many parishes were left without clergy for months or even years. When replacement priests did arrive, they were often poorly trained men who had been rushed through their studies to fill the desperate need for religious leadership. This shortage of clergy meant that many of the dead had been buried without proper religious rites, a fact that tormented the survivors who worried about the spiritual fate of their loved ones. Had their souls found peace, or were they wandering in some terrible limbo because they hadn't received last rites? The uncertainty gnawed at the faithful like a cancer, adding spiritual anguish to their physical and emotional suffering. The social fabric that had held communities together had also unraveled. The complex hierarchies and relationships that had defined medieval life had been scrambled by death. Peasants found themselves inheriting land from masters who had no living heirs. Children who should have been apprentices became craftsmen by default when their teachers died. Ancient family lines that had traced their lineage back centuries were snuffed out in a matter of weeks. This social upheaval created unprecedented opportunities for some survivors, but it also left them adrift in a world without clear rules or expectations. A peasant who suddenly found himself in possession of his lord's estate might have gained wealth and status, but he lacked the knowledge and connections needed to manage his new position effectively. A woman who inherited her husband's business might find herself the target of resentment from men who believed such responsibilities belonged to males alone. The breakdown of law and order added another layer of danger to survival. With so many officials dead and the mechanisms of justice disrupted, banditry flourished. Desperate survivors turned to robbery and violence to acquire what they needed. Armed gangs roamed the countryside, taking what they wanted from those too weak or few in number to resist. The roads between settlements became hunting grounds for predators who had learned that the dead tell no tales. Some survivors responded to this lawlessness by banding together in small, heavily armed groups that trusted no outsiders. These communities became fortress-like in their isolation, viewing any stranger as a potential threat. While this provided some measure of protection, it also cut them off from the wider world and made recovery more difficult. Knowledge, resources, and people that might have helped rebuild civilization remained scattered and separated by walls of suspicion and fear. The climate itself seemed to conspire against the survivors. The period following the Black Death coincided with the beginning of what historians would later call the Little Ice Age, a time of cooling temperatures and unpredictable weather patterns. Crops failed more frequently, winters lasted longer, and the growing seasons became shorter and less reliable. It was as if nature itself had decided to compound the misery of those who had already suffered so much. These harsh conditions made survival even more precarious. A failed harvest that might have been merely inconvenient in better times could now mean starvation for an entire community. A harsh winter could kill as surely as the plague had, though perhaps more slowly. The survivors found themselves locked in a constant battle against both human enemies and natural forces that seemed determined to finish what the pestilence had started. Medical knowledge, never particularly advanced in medieval times, had actually regressed in many areas. The physicians and healers who had possessed what little understanding existed of anatomy and treatment had largely perished during the plague years. Their replacements were often charlatans or desperate amateurs who relied more on superstition than skill. This meant that even minor injuries or illnesses could prove fatal when they might have been treatable before the catastrophe. The psychological impact of this medical ignorance was profound. Survivors lived in constant fear that any symptom, no matter how minor, might herald the return of the plague or some other fatal disease. A cough, a fever, a skin irritation could send entire communities into panic. People became hypochondriacs by necessity, monitoring their bodies obsessively for signs of impending doom. This medical paranoia was compounded by the fact that many survivors suffered from what we would now recognize as severe trauma and depression. They had witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, but medieval society had no understanding of mental health or effective treatments for psychological wounds. Survivors were expected to simply carry on as if nothing had happened, to rebuild their lives without acknowledging the deep emotional scars that the plague had left behind. The children who survived faced their own unique challenges. Many had been orphaned and left to fend for themselves in a world that had little patience for the young and helpless. Those who were taken in by surviving relatives or neighbors often found themselves treated more like servants than family members. The normal processes of education and socialization had been disrupted, leaving an entire generation without proper guidance or preparation for adult responsibilities. These children grew up in a world where death was commonplace and hope was rare. They learned early that life was cheap and that survival required hardness and cunning rather than kindness and trust. The values and traditions that had shaped medieval society for generations were being lost or transformed by the brutal realities of post-plague existence. Religion, which had once provided a framework for understanding suffering and finding meaning in hardship, had been shaken to its core by the plague's indiscriminate slaughter. How could a just and loving God allow such horror to unfold? Why had the pious died alongside the wicked? These questions tormented survivors and led some to abandon their faith entirely while driving others toward religious extremism. Some survivors became convinced that the plague had been divine punishment for humanity's sins and that only through extreme penance could they hope to avoid future catastrophes. Flagellant movements arose with groups of believers traveling from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of religious fervor. Others turned to heretical beliefs or pagan practices, seeking spiritual comfort in traditions that the church had long suppressed. The artistic and cultural life that had begun to flourish in medieval Europe also suffered devastating losses. Craftsmen who had spent decades perfecting their skills died before they could pass their knowledge on to apprentices. Libraries burned when there was no one left to tend them. Musical traditions were lost when entire choirs perished. The accumulated wisdom and beauty that represented humanity's highest achievements were scattered to the winds like ashes from a funeral pyre. Yet perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the way the plague had poisoned human relationships. Survivors had learned to view each other with suspicion and fear. Every new acquaintance might be carrying the seeds of death. Every kiss, every embrace, every moment of intimacy carried the risk of infection. Love itself had become dangerous, and many survivors chose isolation over the risk of losing anyone else they cared about. The loneliness that resulted from this emotional withdrawal was crushing. Humans are social creatures, and the survivors found themselves trapped between their need for connection and their terror of loss. Some went months or even years without meaningful human contact, becoming strange and feral in their isolation. Others formed tentative relationships, only to have them shattered by death or betrayal, reinforcing their belief that trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. As you stood in the ruins of your former life, breathing air that still carried the faint scent of decay, you began to understand the terrible irony of your situation. You had survived the worst catastrophe in human history, but the world you had survived into was barely worth living in. The plague had not just killed people, it had killed a way of life, a set of beliefs, a vision of what human existence could be. The future stretched ahead of you like a vast wasteland, filled with uncertainty and danger. Would you live to see another winter? Would the plague return to claim you as it had claimed so many others? Would you ever again know the simple pleasures of a full belly, a warm fire, or the companionship of friends who weren't haunted by memories of the dead? These were the questions that tormented every survivor as they faced each new day in a world that had been fundamentally broken by pestilence and death. They had lived through the Black Death, yes, but in many ways they were still dying from it, slowly and painfully, one shattered dream at a time. The Black Death had taught humanity a terrible lesson about the fragility of civilization and the randomness of fate, and for those who survived to learn that lesson, the knowledge was almost too bitter to bear. Looking at the medieval nightmare of finding love continues, and in this part, we delve deeper into the supernatural terrors that plagued romantic relationships, making even the simplest expression of affection potentially deadly. The spectre of witchcraft accusations hung over every romantic interaction like a poisonous cloud. In medieval minds, love itself was suspect, too powerful, too transformative to be entirely natural. When someone fell suddenly and deeply in love, when a woman seemed unusually attractive, or when a man abandoned his family for another, the explanation was often supernatural. Love potions, enchantments, and demonic influence were believed to be the true causes behind romantic passion. Women bore the heaviest burden of these accusations. Any woman who possessed unusual beauty, healing knowledge, or simply inspired intense desire risked being branded a witch. The very qualities that made someone romantically appealing, intelligence, independence, knowledge of herbs, were precisely the traits medieval society associated with supernatural malevolence. Consider the case of a village healer named Brigid, skilled in the use of medicinal plants and sought after by young women seeking remedies for monthly pain or advice about fertility. When the local lord's son began visiting her cottage frequently, supposedly for treatments, but clearly smitten with her knowledge and gentle manner, whispers began to spread. Surely such an educated woman must be practicing dark arts. When the young man eventually broke his betrothal to marry Brigid instead, the accusations became a roar. The church actively encouraged these supernatural fears as a method of controlling romantic behavior. Priests taught that excessive passion was inherently sinful and likely demonic in origin. Young people were instructed to be suspicious of their own emotions, to view romantic desire as potentially dangerous spiritual corruption. This created a psychological nightmare where the very act of falling in love became a source of terror rather than joy. Medieval medical texts described romantic love as a form of mental illness called amor hereos, or love sickness. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, fasting, and prayer to cure those afflicted with romantic feelings. The symptoms they listed, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, obsessive thoughts about the beloved, were indeed real, but their understanding filtered everything through a worldview that saw demonic influence in every strong emotion. The fear of love, magic pervaded every level of society. Wealthy nobles employed food tasters not just to guard against poison, but to detect love potions. Merchants watched their daughters carefully, worried that business rivals might use supernatural means to manipulate romantic attachments. Even peasants lived in terror that romantic competitors might employ cunning women to cast spells, stealing away their beloved's affections. These fears weren't entirely without foundation within the medieval worldview. A thriving underground economy existed around love magic, with folk healers and wise women offering potions, charms, and spells designed to kindle, enhance, or destroy romantic feelings. While many of these practitioners were simply herbalists using natural aphrodisiacs or psychological manipulation, medieval society saw them as wielding genuinely supernatural powers. The consequences were devastating. Young lovers found themselves caught between their natural feelings and a society that viewed those feelings as potentially demonic. They had to hide their emotions, suppress their passions, and constantly worry that their love might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption. The trial records reveal case after case of love affairs destroyed by accusations of magic. Young women were burned at the stake for the crime of being too attractive, too charming, or too successful in matters of the heart. Men found themselves accused of using supernatural means to seduce women above their social station. Even when formal accusations weren't made, the fear of love magic created an atmosphere of constant suspicion. Couples had to be extraordinarily careful about how they expressed their feelings, worried that too much passion might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural manipulation. This superstitious terror poisoned the very foundation of romantic relationships. How could someone fully open their heart when they'd been taught that romantic passion might be evidence of demonic influence? The medieval world had literally demonized love, turning what should have been humanity's most beautiful emotion into a source of mortal danger. The psychological impact was immense. People learned to distrust their own hearts, to view their deepest emotions as potential evidence of spiritual corruption. Love, which should bring joy and connection, became instead a minefield of supernatural terror and social suspicion. And so, as we drift towards sleep tonight, we can be grateful that we live in an age where falling in love is seen as natural and beautiful, rather than potentially supernatural and dangerous. The medieval world may have given us romantic literature and courtly love traditions, but it also created a climate of fear around the very emotions that make us most human. Close your eyes now, and let the terrors of medieval romance fade into the darkness where they belong. In our world, love is a blessing, not a curse, and hearts can open without fear of accusation or supernatural suspicion. Part 4. The supernatural terror of medieval romance. But perhaps no aspect of medieval romance was more terrifying than the pervasive belief that love itself could be the work of dark magic. In a world where the supernatural lurked behind every shadow, where devils whispered temptations and witches brewed potions in moonlit forests, the very act of falling in love was viewed with deep suspicion and fear. The medieval mind saw enchantment everywhere, especially in matters of the heart. When a nobleman suddenly became infatuated with a serving girl, or when a merchant's wife abandoned her family for a wandering minstrel, the explanation was clear to all who witnessed it. Witchcraft was at work. Love potions, enchanted amulets, and demonic pacts were believed to be the true causes of romantic passion, not the natural stirrings of the human heart. Women bore the brunt of these accusations. Any woman who possessed unusual beauty, healing knowledge, or simply the misfortune to inspire intense desire was at risk of being branded a witch. The very qualities that made someone attractive, intelligence, independence, a way with herbs or animals, were precisely the traits that medieval society associated with supernatural malevolence. Consider the tragic tale of Marguerite de Porret, a French mystic and author who lived in the late 13th century. Marguerite wrote passionate spiritual texts about divine love, describing her soul's union with God in language so fervent and sensual that it scandalized the church authorities. Her crime was not heresy in the traditional sense, but rather the dangerous act of a woman speaking openly about love, even divine love, with too much knowledge and too much passion. The Inquisition declared her a heretic, demanding she recant her writings and submit to male religious authority. When Marguerite refused to be silenced, refusing to acknowledge that her understanding of divine love was somehow corrupted or demonic, she was burned at the stake in Paris in 1310. Her books were ordered destroyed, though copies survived in secret, passed down by those who recognized the genuine spirituality in her words, rather than the supposed witchcraft her persecutors claimed to see. But Marguerite's fate was far from unique. Across medieval Europe, women who dared to speak of love, to practice healing arts, or to live independently faced similar accusations. The very act of inspiring desire in men was often seen as evidence of supernatural manipulation. If a married man abandoned his wife for another woman, the blame fell not on the man's choices, but on the supposed sorceress who had ensnared him with her dark arts. The fear of love magic permeated every level of society. Noble families hired priests to bless their marriages and ward off enchantments. Merchants carried protective charms to guard against the seductive spells of foreign women in distant ports. Even peasants whispered prayers over their children's cradles, begging God to protect them from the evil eye of jealous neighbors who might curse them to lives of loneliness or destructive passion. This paranoia created a culture where genuine affection was constantly questioned and analyzed for signs of supernatural influence. Was a sudden attraction natural, or the result of a love filter slipped into wine? Did a woman's beauty come from God, or from a pact with Satan? These questions tormented medieval minds, turning what should have been joyful experiences into sources of terror and suspicion. The Church actively encouraged these fears, teaching that excessive passion was inherently sinful and likely demonic in origin. Priests warned their congregations that Satan used beautiful women as his primary weapons against righteous men, that lust was the devil's favorite tool for claiming souls. Love that burned too brightly, that defied social conventions or family arrangements, was automatically suspect. Medical texts of the era, influenced by both classical learning and Christian theology, described romantic love as a form of madness, a disease that clouded judgment and led to spiritual ruin. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, fasting, and prayer to cure those afflicted with what they termed amor hereos, the sickness of excessive love. The symptoms they described, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, obsessive thoughts, were indeed real, but their understanding of the cause was filtered through a worldview that saw demonic influence in every strong emotion. This medicalization of love served to further stigmatize romantic passion, particularly for women. A woman who displayed too much desire, who seemed to enjoy physical intimacy, or who actively pursued a romantic relationship, was likely to be diagnosed as either possessed by demons or practicing witchcraft herself. The cure often involved exorcism, public penance, or in extreme cases, accusations of heresy that could lead to execution. The fear of love magic also created a thriving underground economy of supposed protection and counterspells. Wise women, despite the risks they faced, sold charms and potions to ward off unwanted romantic attention, or to break perceived enchantments. Priests offered special masses and blessings for those who believed themselves bewitched by love. Ironically, the very people society turned to for protection from love magic were often the same individuals who would later be accused of practicing it. Young people growing up in this atmosphere learned to fear their own emotions. Natural sexual development was viewed through the lens of spiritual warfare, with parents and religious authorities constantly watching for signs that their children had fallen under malevolent influence. The awakening of romantic feelings, instead of being celebrated as a natural part of human development, became a source of shame and terror. The legal system reflected and reinforced these supernatural fears. Courts regularly heard cases involving accusations of love magic, with testimony often consisting of nothing more than the claim that someone had fallen in love inappropriately. The burden of proof was impossibly low. If a man abandoned his family for another woman, if a young person defied their parents' choice of spouse, if someone displayed what was considered excessive passion, these behaviors alone could serve as evidence of witchcraft. The punishments for convicted love witches were severe and designed to serve as public warnings. Women found guilty of using magic to inspire love were subjected to public humiliation, physical torture, and often death. Their supposed victims, usually men who had been bewitched into infidelity or inappropriate desire, were typically absolved of responsibility, treated as innocent parties who had been overcome by forces beyond their control. This system created a perfect mechanism for men to escape accountability for their romantic choices, while simultaneously providing society with scapegoats for the disruptions that passionate love inevitably caused to carefully ordered social arrangements. A nobleman could abandon his arranged marriage for a more attractive partner and claim he had been bewitched, allowing him to pursue his desires while maintaining his social standing and avoiding responsibility for breaking his vows. The impact on women's lives was devastating. Those who were beautiful, intelligent, or independent lived under constant threat of accusation. Many learned to deliberately make themselves less attractive, to hide their knowledge, to suppress their personalities in hopes of avoiding suspicion. Others retreated into religious life, seeking protection within convent walls, where their rejection of romantic love could be seen as holy rather than suspicious. But perhaps most tragically, these beliefs poisoned the very experience of love itself. In a world where passionate affection was viewed as evidence of demonic influence, where strong attraction was seen as proof of supernatural manipulation, genuine romantic connection became nearly impossible. Couples who might have found joy and fulfillment in each other's company instead lived in constant fear that their feelings were either sinful or artificial, the product of dark magic rather than natural human emotion. The psychological damage was immense. People learned to distrust their own hearts, to view their deepest emotions as potentially evil or false. The spontaneous joy of new love, the comfort of long partnership, the excitement of mutual attraction, all were tainted by the constant worry that these feelings might be the devil's work. Love, which should have been a source of happiness and connection, became instead a minefield of spiritual danger and social suspicion. Even successful relationships were shadowed by these fears. Couples who genuinely cared for each other had to constantly prove that their affection was natural and godly rather than the result of enchantment. They were expected to demonstrate appropriate restraint to show that their love served God and society rather than selfish passion. The simple act of enjoying one's spouse too much could raise suspicions about the supernatural nature of the relationship. This created a culture where emotional authenticity was not just discouraged, but actively dangerous. People learned to perform the approved forms of affection while hiding their true feelings, leading to relationships built on fear and pretense rather than genuine connection. The very foundation of romantic love, the honest expression of attraction and care, was undermined by the constant threat of supernatural accusation. The children who grew up in such an environment inherited these fears and suspicions, perpetuating a cycle where each generation learned to view love through the lens of spiritual warfare. Young people received their first lessons about romance, not through gentle guidance about healthy relationships, but through warnings about the demonic dangers of passion and the need to constantly guard against supernatural seduction. As we delve deeper into the medieval approach to courtship and marriage, we see how these supernatural fears shaped every aspect of romantic life, creating systems of surveillance and control that made genuine love not just difficult, but genuinely dangerous. The next phase of our exploration will reveal how these beliefs translated into the practical realities of medieval courtship, where young people attempting to find love faced not only social obstacles, but the very real threat of accusation, persecution, and death. In this world where love itself was suspect, where passion was proof of corruption, and where women who inspired desire faced accusations of witchcraft, the simple human need for connection and affection became a perilous journey through supernatural terrors and social condemnation. It was a system that served power and control far better than it served the human heart, creating a medieval romance that was indeed a nightmare of fear, suspicion, and tragic loss. The soft glow of candlelight flickers against stone walls as we delve deeper into the nightmare that was medieval romance. You've heard about the physical dangers, the social constraints, the economic realities that made love a luxury few could afford. But now we must venture into darker territory still, where the very act of falling in love could be interpreted as evidence of demonic possession, where a woman's beauty might be seen as proof of witchcraft, and where the church taught that romantic passion was quite literally a pathway to eternal damnation. In the shadowed corners of medieval Europe, love was not just dangerous to your social standing or physical health, it was dangerous to your immortal soul. The Catholic Church, wielding absolute power over the hearts and minds of medieval people, had developed an elaborate theology that painted romantic desire as one of the most treacherous snares Satan could lay for the faithful. According to church doctrine, passionate love was a form of spiritual sickness, a corruption of the soul that led inevitably towards sin, degradation, and divine punishment. Consider the plight of a young woman named Marguerite, living in a small French village in the year 1348. When she began displaying what we might recognize as the natural signs of romantic attraction, gazing dreamily at the baker's apprentice, losing her appetite, speaking in whispered conversations with other village girls about matters of the heart, her family didn't see the bloom of young love. They saw the unmistakable symptoms of supernatural corruption. The church had taught them that such feelings were not natural human emotions, but dangerous spiritual afflictions. Medieval medical texts, heavily influenced by religious doctrine, actually classified romantic love as a form of mental illness called amor-hereos, or lovesickness. The symptoms they described, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, obsessive thoughts about the beloved, were indeed real, but their understanding of the cause was filtered through a worldview that saw demonic influence in every strong emotion. When someone exhibited signs of romantic passion, medieval society often responded not with understanding or support, but with fear and attempts at supernatural intervention. Marguerite's father immediately called for the local priest, convinced that his daughter had fallen under a malevolent spell. This wasn't an isolated incident of paranoid overreaction. It was standard procedure in a world where love was viewed through the lens of spiritual warfare. The church played a particularly sinister role in fostering these supernatural terrors. Religious authorities routinely preached that romantic love represented a dangerous departure from proper Christian devotion. They warned that passionate feelings could open the soul to demonic influence, making lovers vulnerable to Satan's temptations. Young people were taught to be suspicious of their own emotions, to view romantic desire as potentially sinful or even diabolical. This religious paranoia created a climate where expressing romantic feelings became an act of considerable courage. A young man composing love poetry risked being accused of practicing dark arts. A woman who showed too much enthusiasm for a suitor might find herself suspected of witchcraft. The very intensity that makes love beautiful became, in medieval minds, evidence of supernatural corruption. The fear of love magic pervaded every level of society. Wealthy nobles employed food tasters, not just to guard against poison, but to detect love potions that might compromise their judgment in marriage negotiations. Merchants kept careful watch over their daughters, worried that rivals might use supernatural means to manipulate romantic attachments for business advantage. Even peasants lived in terror that their romantic rivals might employ cunning women or wise men to cast spells that would steal away their beloved's affections. These fears weren't entirely baseless within the medieval worldview. A thriving underground economy existed around love magic, with cunning folk, hedge witches, and folk healers offering potions, charms, and spells designed to kindle, enhance, or destroy romantic feelings. While these practitioners were often simply herbalists using natural aphrodisiacs or psychological manipulation, medieval society saw them as wielding genuinely supernatural powers. The consequences of this superstitious terror were devastating for ordinary people trying to navigate romance. Young lovers found themselves caught between their natural feelings and a society that viewed those feelings as potentially demonic. They had to hide their emotions, suppress their passions, and constantly worry that their love might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption. Margaret of Wessex, a 15th century wool merchant's daughter, left behind a diary that provides haunting insight into this psychological torment. She wrote of her love for a young clerk named Thomas, but her entries are filled with self-doubt and terror. She constantly questioned whether her feelings were natural or the result of some malevolent spell. She prayed daily for God to cleanse her heart of what she feared might be demonic influence. When Thomas began returning her affections, she became convinced that she had somehow corrupted him through supernatural means. This internalized fear created a vicious cycle. The more intensely someone experienced love, the more convinced they became that supernatural forces were at work. This led to guilt, self-loathing, and attempts to suppress or deny romantic feelings. Young people were taught to distrust their own hearts, to view their deepest emotions as potential evidence of spiritual corruption. The superstitious terror surrounding love also provided convenient weapons for those seeking to destroy romantic relationships. Jealous rivals could destroy a courtship simply by spreading rumors of love magic. Parents opposed to a match could claim their child had been enchanted. Spurned lovers could seek revenge by accusing their former beloved of practicing witchcraft. These accusations carried terrifying consequences. Suspected practitioners of love magic faced trials that often involved torture designed to extract confessions. The procedures for detecting love magic were barbaric and often fatal. Accused women might be subjected to swimming tests where they were bound and thrown into water on the theory that witches would float while innocent women would sink. They faced pricking tests, where investigators searched their bodies for supernatural marks that supposedly proved their guilt. Even when formal accusations weren't made, the fear of love magic created an atmosphere of constant suspicion and paranoia. Couples had to be extraordinarily careful about how they expressed their feelings, worried that too much passion might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural manipulation. They lived in fear that rejected suitors or jealous rivals might spread rumors that would destroy not just their relationship, but their reputations and possibly their lives. The documentation from medieval witch trials reveals the devastating impact of these superstitious terrors on romantic relationships. In case after case, we see love affairs destroyed by accusations of magic. Young women were burned at the stake for the crime of being too attractive, too charming, or too successful in matters of the heart. Men found themselves accused of using supernatural means to seduce women above their social station. The trial records of Agnes Waterhouse, executed in 1566 for witchcraft, illustrate this pattern perfectly. Agnes was accused of using magic to make various men fall in love with her, to break up established relationships, and to cause impotence in men who rejected her advances. The evidence against her consisted primarily of testimony that she was unusually successful in romantic matters and that several men had developed strong feelings for her. In a society where female romantic agency was viewed with suspicion, Agnes's apparent ability to attract and influence men was interpreted as proof of supernatural powers. This case demonstrates how the superstitious terror surrounding love particularly targeted women. In medieval thinking, women were seen as more susceptible to demonic influence and more likely to use supernatural means to achieve their goals. A woman who was too beautiful, too charming, or too successful in love automatically became suspect. Female romantic agency was so threatening to medieval patriarchal structures that it was literally demonized. The fear of love magic also created terrible situations for women who were naturally attractive or charismatic. Beauty itself became suspect. Viewed as potentially supernatural in origin, women learned to downplay their appearance and suppress their natural charm, worried that too much success in romantic matters might lead to accusations of witchcraft. This superstitious terror extended beyond individual relationships to poison entire communities. Villages lived in constant fear that cunning women among them might be practicing love magic. Neighbors watched each other suspiciously, looking for signs of supernatural romantic manipulation. The slightest unusual romantic development, a sudden infatuation, an unexpected marriage, a broken engagement, could trigger investigations and accusations. The psychological impact of living under this constant threat cannot be overstated. Young people grew up learning to distrust their own emotions, to view romantic love as potentially dangerous and possibly demonic. They internalized fears that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. How could someone fully open their heart when they'd been taught that romantic passion might be evidence of supernatural corruption? These superstitious terrors also created terrible dilemmas for people experiencing genuine love. They had to choose between following their hearts and protecting themselves from accusations of magic. Many chose safety over love, suppressing their feelings and entering into loveless but socially acceptable marriages. Others risked everything for love, knowing that their passion might be interpreted as evidence of demonic influence. The documentation of medieval love magic trials reveals the creative cruelty of a society determined to control and suppress romantic feelings. Accused practitioners faced interrogations designed to extract confessions of supernatural activities. They were asked to explain how they had learned their magical arts, to name their demonic allies, and to confess to specific acts of romantic manipulation. The torture methods used in these investigations were particularly horrific because they were designed to extract confessions that would justify the accuser's superstitious beliefs. Women were subjected to sleep deprivation, physical torture, and psychological manipulation until they would confess to anything. The resulting testimonies, extracted under extreme duress, were then used as evidence that love magic was real and widespread. These forced confessions created a self-perpetuating cycle of terror. Each tortured confession provided evidence that supported society's superstitious beliefs about love magic. This evidence was then used to justify more investigations, more tortures, and more executions. The documentation from these trials was circulated widely, spreading paranoia and providing templates for future accusations. The superstitious terror surrounding medieval romance reached its peak during the great witch hunts of the 15th through 17th centuries. During this period, thousands of people, mostly women, were executed for practicing magic, and a significant proportion of these cases involved accusations of love magic. The famous Malleus Maleficarum, the handbook for witch hunters published in 1487, devoted extensive sections to detecting and prosecuting love magic. This systematic persecution created a climate where romantic love became literally life-threatening. Young people learned that expressing passion too openly or successfully, attracting romantic partners, could lead to accusations of witchcraft. They lived in constant fear that their natural emotions might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption. The economic dimension of these superstitious terrors added another layer of horror to medieval romance. Accusations of love magic became tools for economic warfare. Successful merchants might find their daughters accused of using supernatural charms to attract wealthy suitors. Prosperous widows who remarried could face claims that they had enchanted their new husbands. Even peasant women who managed to marry above their station risked accusations that they had used magic to seduce their husbands. These economic motivations meant that accusations of love magic often targeted the most vulnerable members of society. Poor women who had somehow achieved romantic success found themselves particularly suspect. Their inability to afford legal representation or social protection made them easy targets for accusations that could result in property confiscation, exile, or death. As we've seen throughout this exploration of medieval life, the prospects for finding genuine love and happiness in romantic relationships were nearly non-existent. The combination of religious oppression, social constraints, economic pressures, medical ignorance, legal inequality, and constant physical danger created a perfect storm of relationship dysfunction. But perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the supernatural terrors that surrounded the very act of falling in love. Medieval dating wasn't just difficult or challenging. It was a systematic assault on human intimacy and connection. The very institutions that were supposed to support and protect relationships, the church, the legal system, the family structure, were designed in ways that made genuine love and partnership virtually impossible. When we look back at the medieval period, we often focus on the grand narratives of kings and battles, of cathedral building and crusades. But for the vast majority of people living through this era, the most fundamental human experience, the search for love and companionship, was corrupted by forces beyond their control. The medieval approach to romance created generations of people who were taught to fear their own desires, distrust their own feelings, and accept loveless relationships as normal and even virtuous. It's a sobering reminder of how social systems can shape and distort the most basic human experiences, and how far we've come in recognizing the fundamental right to love and be loved freely. As we continue our journey through the nightmarish landscape of medieval romance, we'll explore how these supernatural fears combined with other factors to create a world where love was not just rare and dangerous, but actively hunted and destroyed by the very society that should have nurtured and protected it. But perhaps no aspect of medieval romance was more chilling than the pervasive belief that love itself could be the work of dark forces. In a world where shadows held whispers, and every unexplained emotion might signal demonic interference, the simple act of falling in love became a spiritual battleground fraught with supernatural terror. Picture this. A young merchant's daughter named Isabel begins showing signs of romantic interest in the local blacksmith's apprentice. She smiles more often, hums while working, steals glances across the market square. In our world, these would be charming signs of budding affection. But in medieval times, her family would watch with growing alarm. Was this natural attraction, or had she fallen under an enchantment? The medieval mind saw malevolent magic everywhere, especially in matters of the heart. When someone fell suddenly and passionately in love, when they abandoned their duties for romantic pursuits, when they defied their family's marriage plans, the explanation was clear to medieval observers. Witchcraft was at work. Women bore the heaviest burden of these accusations. Any woman who possessed unusual beauty, healing knowledge, or simply the misfortune to inspire intense desire, risked being branded a practitioner of love magic. The very qualities that made someone attractive in medieval society, intelligence, independence, knowledge of herbs or healing, were precisely the traits that authorities associated with supernatural malevolence. The church actively encouraged these fears, teaching that excessive romantic passion was inherently sinful and likely demonic in origin. Priests warned their congregations that Satan used beautiful women as his primary weapons against righteous men, that lust was the devil's favorite tool for claiming souls. Love that burned too brightly, that defied social conventions or family arrangements, was automatically suspect. Medieval medical texts described romantic love as a form of mental illness called love sickness or erotic melancholy. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, fasting, and prayer to cure those afflicted with what they termed excessive love. The symptoms they described, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, obsessive thoughts, were indeed real, but their understanding of the cause was filtered through a worldview that saw demonic influence in every strong emotion. This fear of love magic created a thriving underground economy of supposed protection and counterspells. Wise women, despite the risks they faced, sold charms and potions to ward off unwanted romantic attention or to break perceived enchantments. Priests offered special masses and blessings for those who believed themselves bewitched by love. Ironically, the very people society turned to for protection from love magic were often the same individuals who would later be accused of practicing it. The legal system reflected and reinforced these supernatural fears. Courts regularly heard cases involving accusations of love magic, with testimony often consisting of nothing more than the claim that someone had fallen in love inappropriately. The burden of proof was impossibly low. If a man abandoned his family for another woman, if a young person defied their parents' choice of spouse, if someone displayed what was considered excessive passion, these behaviors alone could serve as evidence of witchcraft. The punishments for convicted love witches were severe and designed to serve as public warnings. Women found guilty of using magic to inspire love were subjected to public humiliation, physical torture, and often death. Their supposed victims, usually men who had been bewitched into infidelity or inappropriate desire, were typically absolved of responsibility, treated as innocent parties who had been overcome by forces beyond their control. This system created a perfect mechanism for men to escape accountability for their romantic choices, while simultaneously providing society with scapegoats for the disruptions that passionate love inevitably caused to carefully ordered social arrangements. A nobleman could abandon his arranged marriage for a more attractive partner and claim he had been bewitched, allowing him to pursue his desires while maintaining his social standing and avoiding responsibility for breaking his vows. The impact on women's lives was devastating. Those who were beautiful, intelligent, or independent lived under constant threat of accusation. Many learned to deliberately make themselves less attractive, to hide their knowledge, to suppress their personalities in hopes of avoiding suspicion. Others retreated into religious life, seeking protection within convent walls where their rejection of romantic love could be seen as holy rather than suspicious. But perhaps most tragically, these beliefs poisoned the very experience of love itself. In a world where passionate affection was viewed as evidence of demonic influence, where strong attraction was seen as proof of supernatural manipulation, genuine romantic connection became nearly impossible. Couples who might have found joy and fulfillment in each other's company instead lived in constant fear that their feelings were either sinful or artificial, the product of dark magic rather than natural human emotion. The psychological damage was immense. People learned to distrust their own hearts, to view their deepest emotions as potentially evil or false. The spontaneous joy of new love, the comfort of long partnership, the excitement of mutual attraction, all were tainted by the constant worry that these feelings might be the devil's work. Even successful relationships were shadowed by these fears. Couples who genuinely cared for each other had to constantly prove that their affection was natural and godly rather than the result of enchantment. They were expected to demonstrate appropriate restraint, to show that their love served God and society rather than selfish passion. The simple act of enjoying one's spouse too much could raise suspicions about the supernatural nature of the relationship. The children who grew up in such an environment inherited these fears and suspicions, perpetuating a cycle where each generation learned to view love through the lens of spiritual warfare. Young people received their first lessons about romance not through gentle guidance about healthy relationships, but through warnings about the demonic dangers of passion and the need to constantly guard against supernatural seduction. The documentation from medieval witch trials reveals the devastating human cost of these supernatural beliefs. Countless women were tortured and executed on charges related to love magic. Families were torn apart by accusations and suspicions, and communities were divided by fear and paranoia. The very bonds that should have brought people together became sources of danger and terror. In this world, where love itself was suspect, where passion was proof of corruption, and where women who inspired desire faced accusations of witchcraft, the simple human need for connection and affection became a perilous journey through supernatural terrors and social condemnation. It was a system that served power and control far better than it served the human heart, creating a medieval romance that was indeed a nightmare of fear, suspicion, and tragic loss. As we drift toward sleep tonight, we can be grateful that we live in an age where love is no longer seen as evidence of demonic possession, where attraction doesn't require supernatural explanation, and where the simple desire for human connection is recognized as one of our most natural and beautiful impulses. The shadows that once made medieval lovers tremble with fear have long since been dispelled by the light of understanding, leaving us free to love without terror, to connect without suspicion, and to find in each other's arms not supernatural danger, but simple human comfort. But perhaps no aspect of medieval romance was more insidious than how the very concept of forbidden love became romanticized into something beautiful and noble. The Church's oppressive restrictions on natural human desires didn't simply suppress romance. They twisted it into something fundamentally unhealthy that still haunts our understanding of love today. You see, when the Church declared that passionate love within marriage was sinful and that unmarried love was an abomination, they created an impossible situation. Young people still fell in love because that's what humans do, but now their feelings were automatically categorized as either spiritually dangerous or completely forbidden. This led to the rise of what became known as courtly love, a literary and cultural tradition that celebrated the very impossibility of romantic fulfillment. Courtly love wasn't about healthy relationships between equals. It was about worshipping someone you could never have, usually a married noblewoman who was completely unattainable. The entire point was that the love could never be consummated, never be fulfilled, never lead to actual partnership. The suffering, the longing, the eternal unfulfillment, these weren't bugs in the system, they were features. Troubadours wrote elaborate songs about knights who pined away for ladies they could never touch. Poets spun tales of lovers separated by duty, class, or circumstance, whose love was made pure precisely because it led to nothing but misery. The literature of the time is filled with men who claim they would rather die of love than live without their impossible beloved, and women who are praised for being so virtuous that they drive men to despair. Take the story of Lancelot and Guinevere, which became the template for countless medieval romances. Lancelot, the greatest knight of the Round Table, falls desperately in love with Queen Guinevere, who is married to his lord and friend, King Arthur. Their love is presented as the most noble and pure emotion imaginable, precisely because acting on it would destroy everything they both hold dear. The story ends, predictably, in tragedy, with their forbidden love ultimately leading to the downfall of Camelot itself. But here's what's truly disturbing about this tradition. It taught people that real love was supposed to be tortured, impossible, and tragic. If love came easily, if it led to happiness and partnership, then it wasn't really love at all. It was just base physical attraction or practical arrangement. True love, the kind worth singing about, was the kind that made you miserable. This toxic idea seeped so deeply into Western culture that we're still struggling with it today. How many modern relationships have been poisoned by the notion that if it's not dramatic and painful, it's not real love? How many people have confused emotional turbulence with romantic passion, thinking that a healthy, stable relationship must somehow be boring or inauthentic? The medieval church didn't just create a nightmare for people trying to find love in their own time. They created a psychological template that would distort human relationships for centuries to come. They took the natural human desire for connection and intimacy and turned it into a source of shame, fear, and deliberate suffering. Even worse, this tradition specifically targeted women's agency and desire. In courtly love literature, women were placed on pedestals as pure, ethereal beings who were too perfect for earthly love. They were worshipped from afar, but never treated as real people with their own desires and needs. A woman who showed too much interest in romance, who actively pursued what she wanted, who enjoyed physical pleasure. She didn't fit the courtly love ideal. She was either ignored by the poets or demonized as a temptress. The church had created a culture where women were expected to be simultaneously inspiring and untouchable, desired and pure, the object of devotion and the source of spiritual danger. It was an impossible standard that left real women trapped between being seen as saints or whores, with no middle ground for being simply human, and the men weren't much better off. The courtly love tradition taught them that their worth as lovers was measured by how much they could suffer in silence, how many impossible quests they could undertake, how thoroughly they could worship a woman without ever expecting her to reciprocate as an equal partner. It was a recipe for emotional immaturity and unhealthy obsession dressed up as romantic nobility. The most tragic part is that this wasn't an accident. The church and the feudal system needed people to channel their emotional energy into something that wouldn't threaten the established order. Courtly love was the perfect solution. It gave people an outlet for romantic feelings, while ensuring those feelings could never lead to actual partnerships that might disrupt arranged marriages, political alliances, or social hierarchies. By making impossible love into the highest romantic ideal, medieval society created a safety valve that allowed people to fantasize about passion and choice while never actually threatening the system that denied them both. It was social control disguised as romantic literature, and it was devastatingly effective. The legacy of this twisted understanding of love can be seen everywhere in our culture today. The idea that love should be effortless and perfect, or conversely, that it should be a constant struggle that requires dramatic gestures and emotional suffering. The notion that unrequited love is somehow more pure or noble than mutual affection. The belief that if someone is too available, too interested, too easy to be with, they must not be worth having. Medieval dating wasn't just a nightmare because of the practical dangers and social restrictions. It was a nightmare because it poisoned the very concept of love itself, turning it from a source of joy and connection into a beautiful form of torture that people were taught to crave. And in many ways, we're still trying to recover from that poison today. The deepest horror of medieval romance wasn't the disease or violence or supernatural terror. It was the way an entire civilization convinced itself that love was supposed to hurt, that fulfillment was a betrayal of true passion, and that the greatest romantic achievement was to want what you could never have. They didn't just make dating dangerous. They made the very idea of healthy love seem somehow false and inferior. And perhaps that, more than all the plagues and persecutions and political machinations, is why we should be grateful that those dark ages are finally behind us. The strangest truth about medieval romance was that love itself had become the enemy. Not just unrequited love or forbidden love, but love in any form was viewed through a lens of supernatural terror that would make modern conspiracy theorists seem positively rational. In a world where every strong emotion was suspect, where passion was proof of possession, and where attraction could be evidence of witchcraft, the simple act of falling in love became a journey through a minefield of accusations, trials, and potential death sentences. Consider the peculiar case of Eleanor de Montfort, a young noblewoman whose story was recorded in the chronicles of 13th century England. Eleanor had the misfortune of being both beautiful and intelligent, a combination that medieval society found deeply suspicious. When she began receiving attention from multiple suitors, whispers started immediately. How could one woman attract so many men unless she was using supernatural means? The gossip escalated when Eleanor showed a preference for scholarly conversation over embroidery, when she could read Latin, and when she displayed what her contemporaries called an unseemly knowledge of herbs. The accusations began subtly. A rejected suitor claimed he had been under an enchantment when he pursued her. A local priest noted that she seemed unusually confident for a woman. Her own maid, perhaps seeking favor or simply terrified of association, testified that Eleanor kept strange books and had been seen gathering plants by moonlight. The evidence was circumstantial, but in medieval times, circumstantial evidence was often more than enough. Eleanor's trial for practicing love magic became a template for hundreds of similar cases across Europe. The proceedings revealed the twisted logic that governed medieval attitudes toward romance. The prosecution argued that no woman could naturally inspire such devotion in multiple men without supernatural assistance. Eleanor's education was presented as evidence of her unnatural nature. Her beauty, rather than being seen as a gift from God, was interpreted as a sign of demonic influence. Even her attempts to defend herself were viewed with suspicion, because assertiveness in a woman was clearly proof of corruption. The testimony from her accusers revealed the paranoid mindset that surrounded medieval romance. Men who had pursued Eleanor claimed they had been bewitched into feeling desire. They described experiencing symptoms that we would now recognize as perfectly normal romantic attraction, but which medieval medicine interpreted as evidence of magical manipulation. Sleeplessness, loss of appetite, obsessive thoughts about the beloved, all were seen as proof that supernatural forces were at work. The trial records show how thoroughly the fear of love magic had penetrated medieval society. Witnesses testified about Eleanor's supposed ability to make men fall in love through various supernatural means. Some claimed she used love potions. Others insisted she had made pacts with demons. A few even suggested that her very presence could cloud men's judgment, making them forget their duties to family and God. The idea that Eleanor might simply be an attractive, intelligent woman who inspired natural affection was never seriously considered. Eleanor's defense, such as it was, relied on character witnesses who testified to her piety and good works. But even these testimonies were twisted by the prosecution. Her charitable acts were reinterpreted as attempts to gain power over the community. Her religious devotion was seen as a cover for her true nature. Her kindness to animals and skill with herbal remedies became evidence of her connection to dark forces. In medieval logic, anything that made a woman remarkable also made her suspect. The psychological torture inflicted during these trials was particularly cruel because it targeted the very emotions that make us human. Eleanor was forced to examine every feeling she had ever experienced for signs of supernatural corruption. Had she ever felt more than appropriate affection for anyone? Had she ever experienced physical desire? Had she ever been angry or jealous or proud? Each normal human emotion was presented as potential evidence of demonic influence. The interrogations revealed the impossible standards that medieval women were expected to meet. They were supposed to be pure but not cold, beautiful but not vain, intelligent but not learned. kind but not forward, faithful but not passionate. Any deviation from this narrow path could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption. Eleanor, like so many women of her time, found herself trapped in a system where being fully human was essentially illegal. The trial also demonstrated how love magic accusations served as weapons in the broader struggle for social control. Eleanor's case occurred during a period of political tension between rival, noble families. Her marriage could have shifted the balance of power in the region, and the accusations of witchcraft provided a convenient way to remove her from the marriage market, while simultaneously reinforcing the idea that women who exercised any degree of agency were dangerous. The broader community's reaction to Eleanor's trial revealed how deeply the fear of love magic had infected medieval society. Neighbors who had known her since childhood suddenly recalled suspicious incidents. A baker testified that bread rose unusually well when Eleanor was present. A merchant claimed that his horses seemed calmer around her. A priest remembered that she had once asked too many questions about theological matters. Every positive quality was reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural influence. The economic dimensions of these accusations created additional layers of terror for medieval women. Eleanor's family faced enormous pressure to distance themselves from her to protect their own reputation and property. Her dowry was confiscated, her personal possessions were examined for evidence of magical implements, and her future prospects were destroyed regardless of the trial's outcome. The mere accusation of practicing love magic was often enough to ruin a woman's life completely. The trial records also reveal the creative cruelty of medieval torture methods designed specifically for love magic cases. Eleanor was subjected to sleep deprivation to break down her resistance to confession. She was forced to undergo physical examinations, searching for supernatural marks that supposedly proved her guilt. The interrogators used psychological manipulation, alternating between promises of mercy and threats of execution to extract the confession they sought. Eleanor's story illustrates how the supernatural terror surrounding love created a perfect storm of gender-based persecution. Women who were too beautiful faced accusations of using magic to enhance their appearance. Women who were too successful in love were suspected of supernatural manipulation. Women who showed any independence or intelligence were seen as unnaturally empowered. There was literally no way for a woman to live fully without risking accusations of witchcraft. The case also demonstrates how love magic accusations serve to reinforce broader social hierarchies. Eleanor's education and intelligence threatened the established order where women were supposed to be passive and ignorant. Her ability to attract multiple suitors challenged the male prerogative to control romantic relationships. Her confidence and articulation violated expectations of feminine submission. The accusations of witchcraft provided a socially acceptable way to punish these transgressions. The torture methods used in Eleanor's case were designed not just to extract confessions, but to serve as public warnings to other women. The proceedings were conducted openly, with detailed accounts circulated throughout the region. The message was clear. Women who stepped outside their prescribed roles, who showed too much agency in matters of love, who appeared too confident or capable, would face similar consequences. Eleanor's trial ended, as most such trials did, with a forced confession extracted through torture and psychological manipulation. She was made to admit to practicing love magic, to consorting with demons, and to using her beauty and intelligence as weapons against godly men. The confession, though obtained under extreme duress, was then used as evidence to justify the entire proceeding and to warn other women about the dangers of supernatural corruption. The aftermath of Eleanor's case created a climate of fear that lasted for generations. Women in the region learned to suppress their natural attractions, to hide their intelligence, to minimize their beauty, and to avoid any behavior that might be interpreted as supernatural. The vibrant, confident Eleanor who had entered the trial was replaced by a generation of women who lived in constant fear of their own emotions and abilities. Eleanor's story, though extreme, was not unusual for its time. Across medieval Europe, thousands of women faced similar accusations, similar trials, and similar fates. The fear of love magic had created a systematic persecution of female agency that destroyed countless lives and poisoned romantic relationships for centuries. The legacy of these beliefs would persist long after the medieval period ended, influencing attitudes toward women, sexuality, and romantic relationships well into the modern era. The supernatural terror surrounding medieval romance represented perhaps the most comprehensive assault on human emotional life in recorded history. By making love itself suspect, by treating attraction as evidence of corruption, and by punishing women for inspiring desire, medieval society created a system where genuine intimacy became nearly impossible. The brave individuals who risked everything for love during this period faced not just social disapproval, but literal accusations of trafficking with demons. As we reflect on Eleanor's fate and the countless others like her, we see how the combination of religious extremism, gender oppression, and supernatural paranoia created a perfect storm of persecution that made medieval romance truly nightmarish. These women weren't just fighting for love, they were fighting for the right to be fully human in a world that had made humanity itself a crime punishable by death.